The fact that America is an exceptional nation is regularly intoned by virtually every political figure, and I think more revealingly, the same is true of prominent academic and public intellectuals. So, for example, when Iran comes to the aid of the government of Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan in defense against the assault of ISIS, that's destabilization. We have to prevent it, if not aggression, perhaps. In contrast, when the United States invades Iraq, it kills a couple 100,000 people, generates millions of refugees, destroys the country, sets off a sectarian conflict that's tearing Iraq and by now the whole region to shreds, and on the side increases terrorism worldwide by a factor of 7 just in the first year. That's stabilization, part of our mission that we must continue for the benefit of the world. The identity of the United States is defined by a set of universal political and economic values, namely liberty, democracy, equality, private property, and markets. So the U.S. has a solemn duty to maintain its international primacy for the benefit of the world. Actually, the exceptionalism of U.S. doctrinal institutions is quite wondrous to behold. Well, going on with the Washington Post editors, they join Obama's Clinton negotiator, Dennis Ross, Thomas Friedman, other notables, in calling on Washington to provide Israel with B-52 bombers, and perhaps even the more advanced B-2 bombers, and also huge, what are called massive ordnance penetrators, bunker busters informally. There's a problem. They don't have airstrips for huge planes like that, but they can use maybe Turkey's airstrips. And none of this is for defense. These are not defensive weapons, remember. All of these weapons are offensive weapons for Israel to use to bomb Iran if it chooses to do so. And since Israel is a U.S. client, it inherits from the master the freedom from international law. So nothing surprising about giving it vast supplies of offensive weapons to use when it chooses. Well, the violation of international law goes well beyond threat, goes to action, including acts of war, which are proudly proclaimed, presumably because that's our right as an exceptional nation again. One example is the successful sabotage of Iranian nuclear installations by cyber war. The Pentagon has views about cyber war. The Pentagon regards cyber war as an act of war, which justifies a military response. And a year ago, NATO affirmed the same position, determined that aggression through cyber attacks can trigger the collective defense obligations of the NATO alliance, meaning if any country is attacked by cyber war, the whole alliance can respond by military attacks. That means cyber war attacks against us, not by us against them. And the significance of these stands is, again, something that it wouldn't do to mention. And you can check to see that that condition is well observed. Well, perhaps the United States and Israel are justified in cowering in terror before Iran because of its extraordinary military power. And it's possible to evaluate that concern. For example, you can turn to the authoritative analysis, detailed analysis of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the main source for such information, last April, which conducted and published a long study of the regional military balance. And they find, I'll quote, a conclusive case that the Arab Gulf states have an overwhelming advantage over Iran in both military spending and access to modern arms. That's the Gulf Cooperation Council states, that's Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. They outspend Iran on arms by a factor of 8. It's an imbalance that goes back decades. And their report observes further that the Arab Gulf states have acquired and are acquiring some of the most advanced and effective weapons in the world, while Iran has been essentially forced to live in the past, often relying on systems originally delivered at the time of the Shah, 40 years ago, which are essentially obsolete. And the imbalance is, of course, even greater with Israel, which, along with the most advanced U.S. weaponry and its role as a virtual offshore military base of the global superpower, has a huge stock of nuclear weapons. There are, of course, other threats that justify serious concern and can't be brushed aside. A nuclear weapon state might leak nuclear weapons to jihadis. No joke. In the case of Iran, the threat is minuscule. Not only are the Sunni jihadis the mortal elements of Iran, but the ruling clerics, whatever one thinks of them, have shown no signs of clinical insanity, and they know that if there was even a hint that they were the source of a leaked weapon, they and all they possess would be instantly vaporized. That doesn't mean that we can ignore the threat, however, not from Iran, where it doesn't exist, but from U.S. ally Pakistan, where the threat is in fact very real. It's discussed recently by two leading Pakistani nuclear scientists, Pervez Hudboy, Zia Mian, Britain's leading Journal of International Affairs. They write that increasing fears of militants seizing nuclear weapons or materials and unleashing nuclear terrorism have led to the creation of a dedicated force of over 20,000 troops to guard nuclear facilities. There is no reason to assume, however, that this force would be immune to the problems associated with the units guarding regular military facilities, which have frequently suffered attacks with insider help. In other words, the whole system is laced with jihadi elements, in large measure because of what Patrick Coburn described, the Wahhabization of Sunni Islam from Saudi Arabia and with the strong support of the United States ever since the Reagan administration. Well, in short, the problem is real enough, very real in fact. It's not being seriously addressed. It's not even discussed. Rather, what we're concerned about is fantasies concocted for other reasons about the current official enemy.